It's Ramamoorthy.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ram, and I'm a roboticist. What does that mean? Well, sometimes I'm an engineer who builds things. Sometimes I'm a professor who teaches people to build things. A lot of the times, I'm a scientist who's trying to figure out how things work. Maybe if the next 5 minutes go well, I'm a comedian too. Well, the best part of my job is to be able to ask why all the time. Why is it like that? And sometimes I ask, well, that's weird. What's going on there? So the other day I was watching Netflix. This is what you're meant to do in the middle of a pandemic. This is how you save the world, watch Netflix. So I was watching Netflix and it occurred to me, well, this is weird. There are a lot of doctors on TV. So I'm old school, so I like Hawkeye Pierce from MASH or his friends. Maybe some new age people would like Mindy. She's quite popular on Netflix these days. In between, there have been Scrubs, and there are lots of doctors out there. But here's the thing. Every single doctor on TV knows exactly what's going on. They walk in, their coat flying behind them like a cape. They take one look and they know this is it. This is what you need to do, and then now I'm off to the pub. Well, in reality, I do work with doctors, and they're not quite so confident all the time. So to give you an example, the other day I had a conversation with a collaborator who's a breast cancer surgeon. And he tells me, well, by the time you find breast cancer in a mammogram, it's too late. So by then, it's already grown, the tumor is there, and you haven't really helped this woman at all. What you really need to do is to find it when it's still a tiny, tiny, incipient tumor. But we don't know how to do that. People are very uncertain about how to find something like this. Then I speak to a different collaborator who's a neurosurgeon, and we ask a very, very simple question, the way it would seem to a child, which is, have you scooped it all out? You're doing brain cancer surgery, but ultimately you're just scooping stuff out. Have you scooped it all out? Turns out, to answer that question, you need to do Nobel Prize-winning physics. You need to have fluorescence. You need to figure out where all the cells are. So it's all really, really uncertain. Nobody really knows for certain what's going on in medicine. So at this point, I think to myself, well, I'm a computer scientist. I'm a doctor too. Let me through. I have robots. Robots are going to come save the day. So I tried this a few times, and people seemed a bit skeptical. They said, well, these doctors have gone to school for a long period of time. They've read lots of books. They know fancy Latin words. All of that is true. But have you ever spoken to a doctor about how they were taught how surgery works? So they know all of these things from the books, but how do they actually do it with their hands? So I've had that conversation because I was really curious. I wanted to know, how do you teach the next person exactly what they should do? And the words they use are really interesting. So at one point, I was told by a brain surgeon, well, actually, brain feels a lot like jelly. So you keep cutting through the jelly. And at some point, you hit dura, which is like a leather jacket. And a certain kind of tumor, it actually feels like creme brulee, but then a different kind of tumor feels like avocado. And now I'm thinking, are we really doing brain surgery here, or are we talking about dinner? And it turns out this is really how they internalize it. They know a lot of fancy words, but then they have to get the look and feel and touch and smell of it, and that's what makes you a really good surgeon. This is why it takes you 20 years to become one. So the next time you're eating your creme brulee, think about this. You're beginning to become a brain surgeon. But it turns out, if this is how it works, then you can teach this to robots as well, because it's possible for us to use a lot of different sensor technology and things that robots actually have access to. And we can give them all of this data, and robots can do exactly what kids do. They can play around with it for a long period of time. They don't quite know everything that's in the books, but they have the access to all of the data that's out there in terms of every single surgery that was done with an instrument. And from that, we can teach them models. And then in our labs, for instance, robots are learning how to detect breast cancer from microscopy images. We are figuring out what tumor feels like physically in terms of touch when you try to poke it with an instrument. And from that, they're trying to identify exactly where they should place a cut. So all kinds of things are happening. The future is almost here. Not just in my lab, it is happening all over the world. In fact, we are just new entrants to this field. There are some very interesting things going on in the world. So very soon you're going to go into an optician and you would think there's a stodgy old person who's going to sit there and make you read E, F, J, and K. But no, they're just going to take one single photograph of your eye, and we're going to know if you have glaucoma or not. This is what's being made possible by neural networks. Recently, one of my colleagues said, a very senior, distinguished colleague, he said, well, it's about time to shut down all the radiology departments. You know, you don't need people doing this stuff anymore. You're going to have just AI models, and that's going to take over the whole thing. We're going to teach them how to read scans, and they're going to do this. Now, this is when you know that the future is almost here, but maybe you want to be a little bit cautious. So this is when, as a good scientist, you should be asking yourself, is there anything weird going on here? So let me tell you a few stories about what goes on with these models. Those of us who are insiders, we know about this quite a bit, but think about what happens when you teach a computer to figure out the most famous task in machine learning. Is this a dog or is this a cat? So you showed lots of pictures of dogs, even more pictures of cats, because if you're on the internet, you know that it's full of cats. And what the computer does is it looks at it and says, okay, you know, it has these kind of colored pixels, it has these kinds of bright spots, this must be a cat. And then it doesn't have so many bright pixels, maybe this is a dog. It has big ears, maybe it's this. And so we train systems to do this all of the time. People did that. And then somebody was sitting around in a lab, and then they found out, well, there's something curious going on here. There's this model that I've trained. Most of the time when I show it a dog, it calls it a dog. Every now and then it calls it a bus. And we're thinking, okay, you didn't quite go to medical school. You didn't read all of those books. But how can you look at an animal and think it's a bus? You know, what's going on here? And the real problem, of course, is that computers don't really have common sense. Even some people don't, but computers definitely don't have common sense. So what's going on is they have figured out how to replicate what we think people do by looking at lots of little features and building models on top of lots of those features. And that means that you're going to have situations in which it didn't really understand what was going on. It just saw parts of an animal and it thought maybe that looks like a wheel. If there's a wheel, there must be a bus somewhere, so I'm going to call it a bus. Sometimes this has really serious consequences. So the other day, somebody was telling me about the fact that they started putting images into a PowerPoint slide, and then they put in the image of a black person, and then the automatic text that came out was, well, this must be an animal. Now, this is really serious business. We don't want this kind of thing happening, right? So as AI researchers, we are very, very optimistic. I'm very excited about the fact that I can work with brain surgeons and breast cancer surgeons and different kinds of medics and build models. But I also have to bring a little bit of humility to this and think about the fact that we can build models, but we are not trying to get rid of the doctors. We are trying to make their life better. So to give you an example of the kind of thing we are thinking about, the other day I was talking to my brain cancer collaborator, and he was telling me, well, there are these two tumors, chemically and histologically, which is the technical word. These two things look identical. I mean, there's not much of a difference between them. But if you touched and poked them like my 2-year-old son would do, then something is weird. This one is soft and squishy. This one is more like a creme brulee that cracks differently. This one's like an avocado. So what's going on here? And he doesn't know. I don't know. It turns out nobody knows. So there are lots of these kinds of questions about what exactly is going on between the scientific models that are in the books, the touch, feel, look, smell of what's going on, and what we can enable because we have robots, sensors, AI models, and all of these kinds of things. This is the frontier of research. I'm very excited to be part of it. And we are looking at it from the point of view that we want to build really intelligent machines that are very good helpers to these kinds of surgeons and doctors, so that one day I can validly, not in a comedy club setting, validly say, let me through, I'm a computer scientist, and I am actually helping.